The Powkiddy X18S is the upgraded version of Powkiddy's previous clamshell handheld, the X18. Coming in at $179, it's pricing itself competitively with the likes of the RG351MP and other upcoming affordable handhelds. But has Powkiddy managed to package it up with decent build quality and the perfect controls? Unfortunately not. This is a handheld I've been on the fence with for a few weeks now, so let's jump in and I'll show you the review. For those of you that are new to Powkiddy, they've created some below average handhelds in the past, but it's not until recently with the launch of the RGB10 Max that they've started to up their game, and the X18S here is pushing the market in the right direction even if they've cut a lot of corners. So let's start with the packaging and the design. Like any handheld out of China, the packaging is nothing to shout about. It does the job, but you're certainly not going to be displaying it in this thing. When I took it out of the box, my immediate thought was, dang, this is heavy, coming in at around 300 grams, which is a lot heavier than I'm used to. But once it's in your hand, I noticed that the matte grey and the X18 logo and the aggressive modern techie look, which I absolutely dig, is what caught my attention. The outside greets you with these sharp speaker grills which look like they've been taken from a Lamborghini, and next to that you also find yourself a headphone jack which is nicely placed at the front so you won't get tangled. Now moving on to the back, this is where I have some problems. I'll start with the shoulder buttons. They're awful. The handheld is so large, yet they stuck these tiny little skittle-like shoulder buttons to the back, which I struggle to press at times. The R2, L2 buttons are also incredibly sensitive, and I found at times that they like to get stuck into place, meaning I have to force push them to get them out and working again. This really does ruin games that require the use of a lot of shoulder buttons like the N64 and PSP. Secondly, this is definitely a personal opinion and probably due to my chubby hands, but I constantly get my fingers caught in the back of the hinges. When I open it up, I naturally grab it like this to flip the screen up, and these tiny hinges seem to grab my fingers and ram it under the hinge, causing it to pinch me. But again, that just might be me. And finally, on the back you have your main ports. It's good to see USB-C charging and a mini HDMI out port which works well alongside the SD card slot. When it's closed, I really like the Powkiddy X18S. It's sleek, modern and aggressive, but once you open it up, that completely changes and it looks like a blind ape designed the layout. Buttons seem to be just scattered across the inside, all spaced out enough to make the center of the handheld look very awkward. It's as if it's missing something. The analog sticks sit inside the shell to allow it to close, and unfortunately it doesn't even come with L3, R3 functionality. The D-pad as well is smaller than I'm used to a point that I actually really dislike it. The size is much smaller than other handhelds I've reviewed, and it's also incredibly sensitive with very little feedback, making it unpleasant to play on retro games and even fighting games. The A, B, X, Y buttons again feel a little small, and when pressed drop down into the shell, which takes away that bouncy feedback that you'd like from a handheld of this nature. And then the Android and Start Select buttons are okay. They sit at the top and have symbols that make it obvious for gamers to understand, but they just look pretty basic. When you look at it from afar, it just looks cluttered and really awkward, and I think Powkiddy should have taken some more time to design the layout to look a bit more pleasant. The same goes with the display. It's a 5.5-inch HD display touchscreen that works well, but it has a plastic cover over it which can easily show scratches. It's stuff like this that you don't expect to see in a $180 handheld. Plus the grey border just makes it look old. Black would have been much better. But putting that aside, it does compact down into a very portable form factor, and that's the great thing about clamshells. It's just a shame the inside doesn't match the external's aggressive, sleek layout. Now let's talk about the OS and performance. The X18S came with a lot of problems at first, and after a couple of firmware updates, most of the issues were resolved. So for those of you that end up buying this, you won't have these issues. Powkiddy has told us that they'll ship new orders with the latest firmware. When you turn it on, you'll be greeted with what I can only call a very disgusting OS. It looks like something from the 90s and makes this handheld feel very outdated. I'll admit though, this can be easily changed by downloading new apps, but it just goes to show you that Powkiddy really forget about certain important aspects of designing a handheld. They don't take the average consumer into consideration. Instead, they pump out these handhelds and hope that the community will solve the firmware and OS issues themselves, to a point where I could say they almost rely on it. But putting that all aside, this is where things start to get interesting, because the Powkiddy X18S is most definitely taking the next step when it comes to handheld emulators. The Powkiddy X18S is rocking a Unisoc T618 8-core 2GHz processor, a Mali G52 GPU, 4GB of RAM, a 5.5-inch touchscreen display, and a 5000 mAh battery, all running on Android 11. This combination is fantastic. It allows you to play a lot more games than you think. For example, when I pushed this to the limit, Dreamcast games ran flawlessly, to a point where it generally made me smile when I first tested it. And all of this scaled to the 720p screen makes it look that little bit better. The same goes for PSP. It ran incredibly well, and larger games like God of War performed nearly perfectly with no hiccups. Older consoles like Game Boy, SNES and so on performed perfectly through RetroArch. And those of you that have asked, yes, it does even play Sega Saturn II. N64 played well, but due to the awkward controls and tiny D-pad and low quality shoulder buttons, it wasn't very enjoyable, especially playing games that require the trigger buttons. But where does this decent emulation stop? Well, that would be Gamecube. Yes, some Gamecube games do work, but not all of them. Larger games like Super Smash and Simpsons Hit and Run played very poorly on the X18S, which is disappointing, but hey, we can't have everything. Smaller Gamecube games do run, but not flawlessly. We did have the odd crash, some frame rate issues, and audio cracks on a wide number of Gamecube games, but it wasn't enough for me to stop playing. I wouldn't go out and buy this if you're looking for pure Gamecube emulation. It's just not there yet, and as much as I'd love to state this plays Gamecube games, it really doesn't. We'll just have to wait for that in upcoming handhelds, and because it's technically an Android handheld, you can also load up all of your Android games too. I've been playing Call of Duty and Pokemon Unite on here, and it plays really, really well. The Powkiddy X18S can also remote play with Xbox, Steam and Stadia and PlayStation with Bluetooth controllers, but unfortunately I don't have either of those, so I can't show you that. This basically turns your X18S into a little desktop gaming console when combined with the HDMI out function, which in all honesty is pretty cool. The battery life when testing was pretty average too. I managed to get a few hours out of it before it needing some juice, and while testing I did notice when you put the X18S into sleep mode, it still likes to drain a lot of battery, so I recommend, if playing it, turning it off when you're not in use, basically. Overall, I am still on the fence with the Powkiddy X18S. The device itself didn't really wow me, but the sheer power did. If you're impatient and want a new retro handheld that can emulate up to Dreamcast flawlessly with a modern clamshell design, then this is the perfect handheld for you. But for me, the build quality and the awkward placement of buttons just made this handheld feel a little clunky. They cut corners in a lot of places, and when the internals live up to such a high standard, when the design doesn't, it really feels just like an out of place handheld. They're going in the right direction, and I praise them for being the first to put this into market, but you can tell they've rushed it. And because of that, I strongly suggest waiting out a few months for competitors to catch up, because I'm certain they'll be a far more polished game console. So there you have it. As per usual, thanks for watching this review. If you enjoyed it, hit subscribe because I have a lot more retro handheld reviews coming up in the near future. And yeah, catch you in the next one. Peace.